create an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. And that's a commonly agreed upon target. But it's important that we get the schedule right in the early years. In fact, I think that early year schedule is probably the single most sensitive part of this debate and the single most important to achieve in a proper manner. We expect to have the technologies that will allow coal to be burned without carbon dioxide emissions by about the year 2020. And I've introduced, in fact, a separate measure that is a part of this legislation that funds the accelerated research and development for the carbon separation and sequestration technologies that are critical to allow the burning of coal without emitting carbon dioxide. We know that can work. The question is, how quickly can we derive it? And the Electric Power Institute, which is the R&D arm of the electric utility industry, tells us that if we fund that technology with $1 billion annually for a 10-year period, we can derive reliable carbon capture and sequestration technologies by 2020. And the measure that I previously described, which is a part of the draft we're now considering, will contain that critical funding to enable us to derive those technologies by 2020. And so the schedule for reductions between the effective date of the law, let's suppose for sake of discussion that that's 2012, providing a time for the EPA to draft the implementing regulations. That between that time, 2012 and 2020, we simply must allow coal-fired utilities to continue to use coal while taking whatever reductions the law requires, either by installing new efficiencies or by purchasing offsets from agriculture and from forestry. So we need to have a broad availability of offsets. We need to have the opportunity for utilities to install new efficiency and get full credit for doing so under the terms of the bill. That early schedule is critically important, and we're focusing on that as we prepare the legislation for consideration toward the end of May. I want to take just a moment to describe some local things that we're doing with regard to carbon capture and sequestration technologies. I think that subject is particularly fitting for the conference here in Wise County that focuses on energy technology. One of the media in which we hope to have the storage and sequestration of carbon dioxide is unminable coal seams. These have the benefit of being plentiful across the United States. And in fact, probably all of the CO2 that is generated from industry and coal-fired power plants could be stored in the unminable coal seams. They also have the benefit of being situated very close to where CO2 is generated. They're very close to the coal-fired utilities that tend to aggregate around the coal-producing regions of the United States. And so you would avoid the necessity of having to transport carbon dioxide a long distance in order to sequester it permanently in the ground. And the leading work that's being carried out in the country on the use of unminable coal seams for carbon sequestration is occurring right here in Southwest Virginia. It's occurring next door in Russell County, where with $4.4 million from the Department of Energy, we were able to begin a pilot program, a test program at very small scale, injecting 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide into an old gas well in Russell County. That well proceeds down into an unminable coal seam. And so that injection has been made. The monitoring is underway. We'll be getting results from that pilot phase test in the near future. And that will prepare the way to scale up to a very large test. That test will be injecting 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide into an unminable coal seam. And that will involve an expenditure by the U.S. Department of Energy of about $60 million. It will entail the need to have a R&D center somewhere in the region where that test is conducted in order to administer that work. And so we're very hopeful that we can attract that test to Southwest Virginia as well. Last year, we requested and received $1.8 million to do the preliminary work with regard to this large-scale test. That would be site selection and determination and the early geological and engineering work necessary to proceed to the injection of that 100,000 tons. And Southwest Virginia sites are being evaluated as a possible location for that work. Hopefully within a year to 2 years, we can be certain that this region is chosen. I'm optimistic that it will be, and then we can proceed with that larger scale test in this region as well. I think it's a point of pride for the area that we were chosen for the small scale test. It would be an even larger badge of significance if we're chosen for a large scale test as well. There's another element of the legislation that's under consideration which I should report to you this morning, and that is that it will in all likelihood contain a requirement for utilities to generate a certain portion of their electricity from renewable resources. I do not favor a national renewable standard. I think perhaps this subject is best handled state by state, and in fact it probably arguably is the most compelling instance where state by state authorities should predominate as compared to a one-size-fits-all national solution. Nevertheless, it's very clear that the votes exist in both the House and the Senate in order to pass some kind of requirement that electric utilities generate some portion of their electricity from renewable sources. The benefits, arguably, are that the requirement accelerates the market for renewables such as wind, solar, and geothermal. Obviously, these sources of energy, to the extent they're used, further reduce the overall carbon dioxide emissions, having a global warming benefit. But imposing this requirement is a real challenge, poses a real challenge for many parts of the country. There are areas that have plenty of wind and solar. The Southwest is a case in point, where you have in the desert solar, and on the ridges there, lots of wind. But in the Southeast, we have a deficit of both wind and solar resources. And so it would be very challenging for states in the American Southeast to meet any kind of substantial federal requirement that renewables be used for a certain percent of generation. And we're trying to find ways to modify this standard so as to make it achievable everywhere across the country. I think the answer to that lies in qualifying a broad range of fuels in order to meet that standard. For example, mine methane should be allowed to meet that standard where it is captured and electricity is generated from it. And we actually have a mine methane capture electric power plant in Buchanan County. I think it's the only one in America at the present time, but the technology works, the methane is there, and essentially for the owner of the mine, that's a free fuel source. So we should encourage that, largely because methane is very harmful as a greenhouse gas, about 20 times as harmful as CO2. And if it's captured, that carries a major global warming benefit. Landfill gas, the capture of that and generating electricity from it should also qualify. Waste to energy facilities. The qualification of coal-fired utilities that use carbon capture and sequestration technologies. All of these should qualify to meet this standard, and we are urging that they be allowed, and I think we're going to be successful in that regard. But I wanted to tell you this morning that it now looks like there is going to be some amount of requirement at the federal level that electricity be generated in part from renewable sources. Let me talk about some trends that I see in energy policy and particularly in technology development. But I'm going to start with what I think is a very bright future for the coal industry. We're going to succeed in writing a greenhouse gas control bill that will assure the growth of coal. Transportation in the United States